Hello, I'm Annie White, Senior Director of Alumni Relations at Chicago Booth, and we're proud to introduce a new programming series, D&I Dialogues. Over time, this program series will explore many themes related to diversity and inclusion and allow our alumni to discover the impact of bias, create awareness of oneself, and create a few action steps for growth and improvement on a personal level. We're proud to welcome Professor Jane Risen, who will give a sneak peek of her course, Diversity in Organizations. Using insights from behavioral science, her aim is to promote organizational health as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. For the next 45 minutes, Professor Risen will try to distill the content from the full course to highlight a few important themes and concepts. Professor Risen conducts research in the areas of judgment and decision-making, intuitive belief formation, magical thinking, stereotyping and prejudice, and managing emotion. Professor Risen's research has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the ABA Monitor, the Psychology Today. She's a member of the American Psychological Society, Midwestern Psychological Association, and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. Risen received a bachelor's degree summa cum laude in psychology from Harvard University in 2001 and a PhD in social and personality psychology from Cornell University in 2007. For today's talk, we've muted all lines, but if you have a question for Professor Risen, please use the Q&A tool. And now, Professor Risen.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you to the entire alumni team for putting this series together and including me in it. And thank you to everybody who's joining me. I can't see your faces, but it's really wonderful to have people joining on their lunch break or whatever time it is, wherever you are, to learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as Annie said, I put this course together a couple of years ago, and because many of the alumni have not been around when this course was on offer, it seemed like a good idea to try to take the whole course and kind of shrink it down to a 45-minute presentation. So at least we can start talking about these different ideas, all with the goal of thinking about how we can improve organizations' health when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you wouldn't be surprised to know that over the last few years, there's been a greater push for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organizations. And when I was starting to get ready for the class, I started to gather just headlines to kind of highlight this, right? Companies to spend more to achieve greater diversity and inclusion. 175 CEOs and senior execs of the US's biggest companies have signed a pledge committing them to diversity goals. Meet Uber's first diversity officer. So the idea of a diversity officer is a fairly new concept, at least in the how common it is among our large organizations now. And you also see headlines that are telling you why you should be caring about this, right? 6 reasons why diverse companies are more successful. Diverse companies see higher profit and have better focus. Here's why. So there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of awareness, but unfortunately, there's not nearly the kind of progress that I think many people hoped when this became something that so many organizations were focused on. And you can also see this in the headlines. Epic fail. Google spent $265 million on diversity. It did nothing. Sexual harassment training does not work. But really, is unconscious bias training effective or ineffective? How to survive a white workplace as a person of color. Fewer women run big companies than men named John. So despite the interest, despite the awareness, we're falling short. We don't have the know-how that we really need in order to make real effective change. And so today, what I'm going to try to do is boil a lot of different ideas down to 5 big questions. What, who, why, when, and how? And for each of those questions or themes, we'll talk about some of the common mistakes that organizations make and think about how we can do better. So I'll jump right in with the what of it. What should we be paying attention to? What are we trying to improve? And I usually start class pretty early on by having students just reflect on this idea of what does an equitable work environment look like? How would you know if you're in an equitable work environment? And I have students do this on their own and in pairs and then as a full class. You can think about it for yourself right now. And I'll just share some of the examples that people generate. A lot of people talk about hiring processes, right? That they need to be fair and the decisions can't depend on someone's social identity or their background like race, gender, religion, sexuality, and so on. Not just hiring though, right? We also have to move through the company fairly. And so promotion processes also need to be fair and decisions not depend on social identity. Compensation, right? So now the work that I'm doing, I need to be paid equitably for it, equal pay for equal work. And so people talk about compensation not depending on social identity as another component of what it would mean to be in an equitable work environment. Each of these three are kind of formal processes that most organizations have thought through. How do we hire? How do we promote? How do we decide on compensation? But there are a lot of other features that we need to see for an equitable environment. All the other moments when people are at work and they're not being hired or promoted or compensated, what about all the other moments that we're experiencing work? And so employees need to have their voices equally likely to be heard and respected, regardless of social identity. Employees should be receiving credit and blame fairly and equitably, and including giving people second chances to the same extent. We can also think about this in terms of acceptance and belonging. All employees should be able to feel accepted for who they are and not have to hide certain elements of their identity when they come into work. We want everybody to feel like they belong. And employees should be connected in the right networks to the right people in their organization so that they get the information they need, they get the opportunities they need, and they have the support that they need in order to thrive and succeed in their organization. And so this first set, column, I think really translates into creating equal access at the gateways to our organization. These are formal processes that limit who is there and who is not there, and how they're treated in these formal ways. We need to, of course, make sure that those are fair and equitable. But on top of that, we also want to think about all those other moments, right? How do we ensure equal opportunities for success along the pathways? And this gateways and pathways language, I'm borrowing from Dali Chugh, and it should not surprise you to see that these two ideas are going to map very much onto diversity and inclusion. So that the gateways are really measuring things like diversity in terms of representation. What is the representation at each stage of our organization? Whereas the pathways are about inclusion efforts. What's the environment like? What does it feel like? And how am I treated when I go to work every day? With these laid out, I can highlight one of the common mistakes. A common mistake that organizations make is to focus exclusively on the gateways or on their diversity metrics, and to forget about all those other moments, to forget about the pathways to success, to forget about inclusion. And I think this happens for a few different reasons. For one, it's just easier, not easy, but easier to measure the gateways. When you have a formal process, it's a little bit easier to do an audit and to sort of check whether there's bias that's part of it. Harder to do that for the more informal aspects of our work environment. And another reason I think this mistake comes about is because people have a misunderstanding about how diversity works. And so they think that diversity is magic. If you bring a bunch of people who are different together, you're immediately going to see all of the benefits from that. When in truth, the benefits are there as a potential, but diversity can also create conflict. And so unless you have the right environment that allows diversity to emerge in productive ways, it's not going to immediately work. And so instead, I want you to think about the phrase, diversity doesn't stick without inclusion. And this is both in terms of getting the benefits that diversity can offer, and it's also about retaining any diversity that you are able to create. If you want diversity to stick, if you want it to have the benefits that we know it can have, we have to think about an inclusive environment. And so when I think about inclusion, I really mean the degree to which different voices of a diverse workforce are respected and heard and can contribute. And so you're also going to see in inclusive organizational cultures, employees feel as though they're accepted and they belong. And they can really have an influence in the core work that the organization engages in. So if you're a company and you are kind of espousing a colorblind mentality where we treat everybody the same and there is no such thing as race, that's not real inclusion, because you're making people hide important aspects of their identity. And if you have an organization and you bring in people and you tell them that they're there to help specifically with people that look like them, that's obviously also not inclusion, right? That's putting people in, only giving them a chance to work in a certain space. And so real inclusion is going to be allowing to learn from all the different perspectives and differences that you bring into your organization. So instead, you can think of this about the power that traditionally underrepresented groups have to change the organization and its work. And that may not be the way you've been thinking about D&I, but I think it's important to recognize that true inclusion means that people are able to influence the direction of the organization, just as people from groups that have been represented over time. The second question that I want to get to is who, and I mean this in terms of who's responsible for fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion in your workforce. And the mistake we see here is almost any version of it's somebody else's job, right? So if you think that this should be solved by your D&I office or by HR or by the employee resource groups that you have at your organization, anytime you're giving up the responsibility, you're making a mistake. And instead, I think organizations would do better to think about inclusion starts with I, right? That every person is responsible for creating an inclusive environment for all of their coworkers. And so hopefully the technology is going to work on this okay. Here's a pretty short video actually titled Inclusion Starts with I, which is nice. And I think it does two things. One is it highlights why we can all be part of this effort, why we all need to be part of this effort. But the other thing is it's going to come back to think about inclusion that we were just talking about, why it's more than just the representation metrics, why we care about how people are experiencing their day-to-day life. So I think that highlights this idea when everybody that you're interacting with could use a coworker who is thinking about them as an individual, not making assumptions, and creating an inclusive environment where people can be themselves and do their best work. It's also important as an organization that we make it clear we expect this kind of inclusive behavior from all our employees, and we're going to hold them accountable for doing so. And the last part of inclusion starts with I that I want to highlight is that as individuals, before we even come into the workspace, there are things that we may want to learn about and understand better so that we have the skills and the capacity to create a more inclusive environment. And this also often includes grappling with our own unconscious biases and with our own privilege. And these are two, I know, words that have gotten thrown around a lot in the media. They often lead to confusion. And so I thought I would just kind of take a little bit of a detour from our 5 questions and just spend a moment or two on each of these to think about what they mean, why they matter, and what we should sort of individually do so that we are in the best position to foster inclusion in our organizations. So first, unconscious or implicit bias, those terms can be used interchangeably for what we'll talk about here, is that it's a bias in favor of or against one group compared to another, and it occurs automatically. And what I mean by automatically is that it doesn't require awareness, it doesn't require intent, and it doesn't even require cognitive resources or sort of working memory space. And this can take the form of both attitudes, which is our negative or our positive evaluation of certain groups and certain group members. And it's also stereotypes, so the traits that we ascribe to different groups and different group members. Both of these can emerge automatically without us necessarily being aware or intending to have such associations. And so you've probably heard of the IAT, which is the most common test of implicit bias. It's not synonymous, it's just a method, a tool for measuring implicit bias. And there are other tools, but this is probably the most common one, most popular one. If you haven't ever taken an IAT before, I encourage you to do so. You can go to this website and you don't have to fill in any information or anything. You can sign in as a guest and take as many IATs as you're interested in taking. And then you get a score. And it's important to think for a moment about what that score means. It's not telling you if you're a good person or a bad person or anything of that sort. What the score is telling you is what is associated in your mind, what categories go together in your mind, at least at the time of the test. So the score reflects the categories that go together. If black and bad are associated in your mind, then you're going to be faster to do the categorization task when black faces and bad words are paired together than when it's in reverse. And so your score is a measure of your reaction times in certain situations compared to others. What categorizations are you quicker to be able to do? And that's telling you what associations are living in your head. And it turns out this test has been given to millions and millions of people, and there are certain associations that are more common than others. So for example, people tend to have positive implicit attitudes towards younger rather than older, prefer thin rather than overweight, prefer lighter skin to darker skin, and show a preference for physically able compared to people who are disabled. And there's also stereotypes that we know kind of live generally in people's minds. So darker skin or black skin is associated with weapons. Asian pictures are associated with foreignness. And women are associated both with humanities more than with math and science, and associated with family more than with career. And so you don't need to pay attention to these specific numbers. It was just a time when the data were looked at, and it may change a little bit, but these are common associations that are alive in our society and in our culture. It doesn't mean everybody has them, but many people do. And the reason we care about this is because it can affect behavior. So if it just lived in our head, it might be okay, but we know that these implicit biases affect our interactions and the way we treat people. And so this has been looked at across hundreds and hundreds of studies and some meta-analyses, and I tried to list sort of the low end and the high end of the the effect size. So the high end was when scholars who developed the IAT did a meta-analysis, and then the low end is scholars who were sort of very hostile to the idea. They did a meta-analysis and got a slightly lower number, but it's a significant effect in either case. And so just to give you a sense of what some of these studies are, it's things like the callback rate for different job applicants coming from different groups. So people who generally have more bias in their IAT are showing differential callback rates more than people with lower forms of bias. And the extent to which people engage in awkward or exclusionary behavior in their conversations with people from different groups is also predicted by their IAT score. Now, just to be painfully clear about this, you can never look at one person's IAT score and know what they're going to do. That's not the way this works. It's much too noisy to be able to do anything like that. But across lots of individuals and lots of individuals' behavior, we can see that there is a relationship between implicit bias and how we treat others. It's also the case that our own implicit bias will not only affect how we treat other people, but then it can also affect how they respond, how they act. And this was a beautiful study that looked at how minority employees were performing worse when they were randomly assigned 2 days where they were working with a manager who was more biased by according to the IAT that they took. And so when a manager holds bias, it doesn't just directly affect how they treat someone, but then there's also the indirect effect of how that person responds. And so the minority employees are not performing their best when they are paired with a biased manager. It's also the case that you can look at this more aggregated. So because it's a noisy measure, when we move to an more when we aggregate the data beyond just individuals, we can see even much stronger relationships. So it tends to be that places that and spaces that are more biased are also those that have more disparate outcomes by group. So countries with stronger male science IATs, a stronger connection between male and science as compared to women, also show greater gender achievement gaps even in 8th grade science and math classes. US cities with higher levels of racial bias on the IAT have greater racial disparities in shooting by police. And US counties with higher levels of racial bias have greater Black-white gaps in infant health outcomes. So the places that we tend to see more bias in people's minds are the same places that we tend to see more disparate outcomes. It's all correlational, of course, but it gives you an understanding for why people care about these implicit biases, why they matter. So I've been focused just so far on kind of the bad news, that people have biases, sometimes they don't even realize that they have them, and they can affect our behavior. But there's good news too, which is that most people are trying to overcome these biases and their stereotypical preconceptions. Their goal is to treat everybody fairly. And so then we need to, figure out how. What are we going to do? How do we treat people more fairly if there are biases that may be living in people's heads? And I have sort of 3 categories to think about in terms of how to make sure that it doesn't affect our behavior and how we treat people. The first has to do with your own mindset. So actually having a certain mindset for this space is incredibly important for making progress in it. So it's really important to have humility in this space, to recognize that you don't understand other people's life's experience and that there's always more that you can learn. If you think that you're objective and always objective, that's probably your bias. It's important to be mindful, and I mean that in the sense of being able to slow down and be deliberate. We know that biases are more likely to leak in when you don't have the time and the space to create a sort of a deliberate process, when you're kind of acting on a first instinct. A learning orientation is incredibly important, because if I have a learning orientation, then I'm always on the lookout for new opportunities to interrupt bias. I'm always looking to be better about how I engage with people and treat them fairly. If I don't have that learning orientation and I think that a mistake I make now is going to mean I'm a terrible person, then I'm not going to look for opportunities to grow, and I'm also going to be very defensive in this space, and that's never going to be useful. I think it's also useful to remind yourself about your own internal motivations and goals to be equitable, so that these other aspects kind of follow from that. You'll try harder and do better when you realize that this is something that matters and is something important to you. The second category is to think about, how can I change the biases, change the associations that live in my head? So there are short-term fixes that researchers have studied to get like a change on the IAT score, but those don't have long-term effects. What we really need to think about is how are we going to change the associations over the long haul? And to disrupt the associations you currently have, you want to have experiences that are different from just those associations. So if you choose to engage in diverse and inclusive environments, then you're going to have the opportunity to interact with lots of different people in lots of different roles, which will help kind of undo some of the associative learning that you've done over a lifetime. You can also curate your media consumption to make sure that it's diverse and inclusive, whether it's the books you read, the TV and movies you watch, the music you listen to. All of that can allow for you to break down some of the associations that would have developed over time, because our associations are not only from our lived experience, but also from what we see represented. You can also engage in a self-audit, which may include taking an IAT or may just include collecting data from your own life to see where biases may be creeping into behavior and thinking about how to change it. So if you look in your phone and look at your contacts, is that a place where you need to engage in some sort of debiasing? Or again, the media consumption we talked about, or the businesses that you frequent. All of these are things to kind of pause and collect some data to think about whether you are behaving according to your real sort of intentional values. In fact, I give this as one of the exercises in class is to ask students to engage in a self-audit, to collect data from their own life to consider how unconscious bias could be affecting their behavior, decisions, interactions, and judgments. And I encourage all of you to try that if you'd like as well. The third category is decoupling. And this is important because it's something we can do right now. So debiasing is going to take time. Decoupling is much quicker. So decoupling, instead of trying to change the associations in people's minds, the idea of decoupling is to break the link between what's in people's minds and their behavior. So instead of trying to pull a bias out of people's heads, we're going to try to pull bias out of the process itself that we're using. And so you can look at all the different processes that are in your organization and think about where bias can be creeping in and how we can interrupt that bias. So I gave the example here of hiring. So when it comes to hiring, there are certain best practices, things like using predetermined search criteria, standardized evaluation forms, structured interviews so that you're using the same questions with everybody rather than creating them on the fly when you're interacting with somebody. And a diverse search committee, right? These are just some of the best practices. And we can think about our promotion and how we run meetings and how we assign people to different projects. All of these are places where we can think carefully and try to make sure we're pulling bias out of the process, because we know how hard it can be to try to take it out of people's heads. Now I want to turn to privilege, which is in some ways equally or more timely in terms of what people are talking about in the news and in our culture. And I like the term ordinary privilege because I think it helps reduce some of the misunderstanding. So first, I'll just describe privilege or define it. When cultural, legal, or institutional systems are not experienced equally by everyone, but favor some people over others. Ordinary privilege is the idea, it's the part of our everyday identity that we think least about, because we don't need to. And so Dali Chug uses this term, and I like it very much. She says, what makes ordinary privilege ordinary is that it is not something that makes us stand out as an elite or feel special. What makes ordinary privilege a privilege is that it usually brings us some influence not easily given to those who lack it. And so because we are each made up of all sorts of different identities, everybody has a unique set of headwinds. Those are the things that are kind of the obstacles you face, the things that are blocking you, that make your life a little bit more complicated and difficult. And then we have tailwinds, things that are kind of helping us along, usually with us not noticing that it's helping. And so every person has a collection of headwinds and tailwinds. And so what we can do is locate our ordinary privilege. And when we locate it, one suggestion is just to start thinking about yourself. Say, I am blank, and start listing things that come to mind immediately when you're answering that question. So for me, I could say, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am a psychologist, I am a professor. And what you tend to find is that the identities you forget altogether, or the identities that come pretty late in the game, they're often identities where you are hiding some of your privilege, where that's where you can find it. And so, for example, I didn't say I am white, but of course that's going to provide me with privilege. And I didn't mention that I was heterosexual, but again, that's a place where I have some privilege. Same thing with my physical mobility. The places where I don't tend to think much about my identity because it doesn't create obstacles in my life usually means that those are opportunities those are places where I have some privilege that other people don't have. And so we locate our privilege not because we want to feel shame or guilt or something of that sort. We locate our privilege because it gives us a place where we can act, we can use that privilege and to use it to help other people who may not have that same privilege. So here's another exercise I give to students is to use your ordinary privilege to help somebody else. Identify an aspect of your identity that brings you influence that's not given as easily to those who lack that identity, and then use that influence to help. And I will say that reading people's responses to how they did this is one of my favorite parts about the class, because it really is inspiring to see that once you locate your privilege, you can find ways to use it in productive ways. Okay, turning back to our questions now. We're at the why. Why are we doing this? And the mistake is to not answer that question, really, is to try to jump on a D&I bandwagon without really understanding why your organization is doing it. It's much better to figure out your why and to align your D&I goals with the broader goals of your organization. When you align your D&I goals, it means that it's going to be built into the organization. It's going to be weaved into the fabric of how the organization operates. If it's not, then it's going to end up being kind of bolted on as an afterthought. And when it's bolted on as an afterthought, it's not going to be a priority. It just can't be the same way as if it's actually built into other goals that your organization has. So there are lots of good reasons for trying to promote inclusion and diversity. When paired with inclusion, diversity has a whole set of potential benefits that can increase your competitive advantage, right? You can reach different customers, lower your costs, improve talent acquisition, provide flexibility, improve creativity and problem solving in groups, and it even will help individuals think more rigorously and carefully when they're surrounded by people who are different from them. So there are all sorts of different reasons. You want to make sure that you are focused on a reason that connects to the broader goals of your organization. It's going to be much more likely that your D&I will take hold if that's the case. Now, of course, beyond all of these business reasons, it's also just the right thing to do. Now, for an organization that is focused on social justice or corporate responsibility or anything of that sort, then this may be all you need as your guiding principle. But if that's not the way your organization operates, then it may be more useful to tie it to the specific goals that your organization is used to articulating and focusing on. The next question is of when. When do we need to get to work on this? And here my advice is to recognize the urgency, because the mistake is that it just gets put off forever. Right? We're going to prioritize D&I after X, Y, and Z, right? I have this fire to put out first, or we have to grow first. And the problem is that it can be put off indefinitely. Here's a quick graph to show you that in March, when the coronavirus hit, American companies cut back on their D&I hiring. Now, of course, companies cut back on all of their hiring, but even more so for D&I, you can see that the steeper blue line drop off after March 2nd. But what you'll notice is that it suddenly spikes back up, right? So after the murder of George Floyd, we see all of a sudden organizations and companies are reminded about how important this is. We don't want to have to remind people. We want it to be something that you think about right now. And so we need to make it a priority now, in part because this is a long haul. You're gonna face frequent setbacks, so you need to get going now. And if it doesn't feel urgent to you, I think it's worth considering whether it's because of aspects of your privilege that may be making it feel not quite so urgent. And if it does feel urgent, which I think would be great, we want to make sure we harness that feeling. And so we are in a moment of time where there is just a national conversation going on about racial equity and racial justice in a way that it is not usually so much of our public consciousness. While that's the case, this is the time to get organizations and individuals to pre-commit to being engaged over time. Pre-commitment is a powerful tool in behavioral science, and this is an opportunity to use it. While people are thinking about this, get them to pre-commit so that when it's not quite as salient in our minds, we're still doing the work that we need to do. The last one that I'll talk about is how we do this work. So let's say we're on board, we want to do this work, we want everyone involved, we know why we're doing it, we want to get started, but how do we actually get started and do it well? And for this, I suggest that we think about how behavioral science and behavioral design can be useful. How do we craft environments that allow behaviors we want to see to be more common and more likely, and behaviors that we don't want to see to fall away and not be as common? So what I'm going to show you here is sort of 4 steps for behavioral design. This was from the Behavioral Insights team. And they were not focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're focused on changing any kind of behavior. So how do we get people to recycle more? How do we get people to pay their taxes? How do we get people to stick to their antibiotic regimen? Well, these are the 4 steps. First, you got to define your outcome. What's the behavior that you're trying to change? And how can we measure this reliably and efficiently? We have to understand the context. We have to visit the situation and the people involved and understand it from their perspective. Why are there problems right now? That's what we're trying to answer, right? Why don't we already see the behavior that we're hoping to see? Once we have a good understanding of why we're not doing things as we want to yet, then we want to target that reason. We want our interventions, our solutions, to specifically target the reasons that we think we are facing problems right now. And just coming up with an intervention isn't good enough. We have to find out if it's any good. You might have an idea, but we don't know if it's actually going to improve things. It could do nothing, and it could even backfire. And so we need to put our intervention into practice and measure to see how it's changing behavior or anything else that you're paying attention to. Whenever possible, you want to use randomized control trials, but of course that's not always a possibility. So with these 4 steps, we can think of mistakes that basically map onto each of them. Forgetting any of these steps is going to be a mistake that's going to be a problem. So there are a lot of organizations that seem to try to improve D&I without ever defining what their goal is or what the outcome is that they're trying to change. And you're just never going to get any traction that way. Or you may jump to solutions before really understanding the problems that you're facing. And one version of this is that even though these problems are so big and complex, somehow people have the idea that really easy solutions are going to work. So a diversity training session, that's a fine thing to do, but if you are doing it with the hope or the goal that it's going to fix all of your problems, that's probably not right, because that's probably not the one missing ingredient from everything that you're trying to do. There's also the case where people are trying out solutions without targeting the specific problem that they have identified or failed to identify. So this is where people tend to expect a one-size-fits-all solution. Oh, I saw this organization tried it, so we're going to do that too. Maybe, and maybe it'll work, but did you have the same problem? Were you trying to fix the same problem? Is the culture and the context and the situation similar enough that we can trust that it's going to work? Other things that people are trying may be a very good idea for you to think about, to consider, but you can't expect that it's going to work without knowing if it's actually targeting the problem you have. So let me just give you 2 examples to try to make this idea of tying your solution to the specific problem a little more concrete, how we dig in to understand what our problems really are. So first I'm sharing, this is data that McKinsey collected a couple years back across hundreds of companies and millions of employees. And what you see is the percentage of employees from entry level at step 1 to the C-suite at step 6, broken down by both gender and race and ethnicity. And so first things first, if you look at this, you can just immediately tell we're not in an equitable environment. But then we want to understand why. And so first I'll push you to think a little bit about gender. So if you look up and just compare the 2 blue boxes for a moment, white men and white women, what you'll notice is in step 1, it's not too different, a little bit different, but not too different. But when you look at step 2, all of a sudden you see huge differences. And so, and if you glance below, you'll see that same pattern more or less among men of color compared to women of color. And so what this is telling us is that if you want to think about helping women get through this pipeline in a productive way, you really want to zero in on that step one. What is happening when people are first brought into the company before their first promotion that is making things different by gender? If we're thinking about race and ethnicity, though, we may end up finding a different pain point. And so again, looking here at the data, if you now look from top to bottom, what you'll see is that even at step one, we already see a lot of some very disproportionate numbers. And so here, the goal may be thinking about your recruiting efforts. How do we get more employees of color in the door in the first place? And of course, if you glance down at the women of color, you'll see that they're going to be facing both of these obstacles, right? And so women of color are coming in the door less and also facing the difficulty of promotion. And so if you're trying to think specifically about women of color in your organization, then step one and step two are both going to be things that you want to focus on. Let me give you one more example. This one is hypothetical. So let's imagine we have a company that's hired 25% women, 75% men, and they're not happy about this. They think this was not good. So they want to change something. Well, then the question is, what should we change? Well, again, if you can dig in further, you're going to have a better idea of where your problem is coming from. So in one state of the world, we're going to imagine that there was no bias when we got our applications, when we narrowed it to a long list, down to a short list. Even the people we brought in for an interview, we were 50-50 all the way through. In this case, what we have identified is that there's a problem with our interview process. Something is going on at the interview where we are bringing people in equal representation and then tending to hire the men. And so we want to look and really concentrate on our interview process to think about whether there's anything there that needs to be adjusted and fixed. In contrast, with this other state of the world, you can see that that 75%, 25% breakdown goes all the way through your process. That tells us that there's no point in your process from the applications where you're losing women, but it means that you may need to think about how you're getting applicants in the first place. So this may be thinking about where you're recruiting or the language you use in your job ad, right? And so even though both of these worlds are dealing with difficulty in hiring, the reason that they're having difficulty looks different, and we want to target our solutions to the specific reason that our company is facing problems. And let me just introduce then the final mistake to the fourth, reflecting back to the fourth step, which is not to try to learn about it, right? Once you have an idea for something that might help, organizations will often just put it into place without having any plan for how they're going to learn whether that was an initiative that was useful or not. So how do we do better? Well, we can use the tools of behavioral science to learn. And so first, of course, going back to these steps, we need to define our goals. What metrics are the ones that are relevant for your organization's why? We want to make sure that we diagnose the situation carefully and then tie our solutions to it, right? If you can understand the cause of inequity in a context, then you can think about what solutions will target it. And remember that when we're trying to diagnose inequity, both in the gateways and the pathways of our organization, we need to step beyond our own lived experience. We want to talk to people and understand why work is experienced differently for other people. And then this is where I get to be a little bit of a broken record. If you signed up and took class with me, over the weeks, is that experiment, experiment, experiment. And I mean this in two different ways. So first, of course, if you can use randomly assigned control conditions, that makes it a proper experiment and really easy to find out whether what you're doing is helping or hurting. We can't always do that. And I also mean the idea of experimenting as willing to try new things. We haven't gotten something that works yet. And so we should be willing to try different things that might help. And if you remember that your goal is learning, then even quote unquote failures, even something that doesn't work or even that's something that backfires, these setbacks still help you understand why things are problematic currently and what you might be able to do moving forward. They're still part of a successful journey, and that's important to keep in mind. So just to briefly summarize these 5 different questions and how we can do better. Remember that diversity doesn't stick without inclusion, so we need to focus both on the gateways and the pathways in our organization. We want to remember that inclusion starts with I. We are all responsible for creating an inclusive climate at work. And the more you can get individuals to feel responsible and part of the effort, the better it is to be, weaved into the organization. Another way you can do that is aligning your priorities to make sure that the goals of D&I map onto the broader goals of the organization so that, again, it's weaved in and built into the organization. We have to get to work now, right? We know that this is a long journey. We got to get started. And we need to use the energy of this moment to make sure that we are committed to long-term change. And finally, we talked about behavioral science and how it can be useful. This really is a call for bringing rigor to D&I. It's too important of a space to pretend like we don't have problems. And it's too important to just guess what solutions are going to work. We need to bring rigor that we have in all other aspects of our organization here too. It's hard to imagine organizations treating other things that they care about the way that they sometimes treat D&I. And we wanna shift that around and change that so that it has real rigor. And with that, that's all that I wanted to share with you. And I hope that we now have time where I can answer some of the questions that you either came in with or maybe that were inspired by this.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane, for all of that really great information and context. So we do have some questions that are coming in. So please use the Q&A tool if you have a question for Professor Risen. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So the first one here goes back to implicit bias. Can people actually overcome implicit bias at an individual level? Is it as easy as making the choice to slow down and being mindful? How can we truly change what's happening on the unconscious level?
So the 3 categories that I listed for you, mindset and debiasing and decoupling, are all useful to us. Mindset is just about the attitude you have towards it. And it is the case that if you deliberate and you slow down and you're mindful, you are less likely to let your implicit associations, your implicit bias, affect the way that you're interacting and treating people. But that doesn't actually change the associations in the head. I think really what you're asking about is this debiasing category. And there, what I tried to point out is that there aren't really quick fixes here. There are, if you just want to change your IAT score, there are kind of things that you can think about. So you can think about counter stereotypical exemplars for example, and then that, if you have those in mind when you complete the IAT, you'll get a slightly different IAT score. But that's not the long-term change that you really want. What you want to do is change the associations that are there, and that requires really interacting differently than you have been, which means creating spaces to interact with lots of people in lots of different positions and roles. And it means things like, as I said, curating your media. So each person can make it their goal to change the bias that lives in their head. But this is a long-term thing, and usually contact with other people is sort of the strongest predictor of that long-term change. But while we're waiting, that's why it's important to have certain mindsets, and that's why it's important to decouple, because while we're in the process of trying to debias our minds, we want to make sure that what's there is not biasing our behavior and our interactions.
Great, terrific for that. So a follow-up question about decoupling. Do you have examples of ways that organizations have applied decoupling to the context of meeting protocols?
So there are some examples for meetings. There's a nice website called Bias Interrupters. I hope I'm getting that right. That's something to check out. And they'll have different categories for hiring and promotion. And one of the categories is meetings. And so there's lots of things that we can think about in meetings. In fact, this is one of the suggestions I've heard I like. It's if you want to know what your company's culture and inclusive climate is like, just look at your meetings. And who is speaking in meetings? Who is interrupted in meetings? who speaks first in meetings, who tends to be kind of pushed to the outside. And so there's a lot to see within your meetings. And there are interrupters to think about, things like amplifying voices, so that when one person brings up an idea, making sure that that's heard and credited to them, rather than when someone else jumps in with that same idea, how do we make sure we say, oh, that's what was brought up by so-and-so? Is an example. Or being very deliberate in that you are not going to let the most senior or the most extroverted person speak first, because then it makes it a little bit harder to hear from everybody else. And so you can deliberately think about the order that you may want to pull out from people. Another common thing, and this is important for those of us in the classroom too, is to sometimes take a beat. Don't let someone just jump right in, but to say, I'd love to hear from somebody who hasn't had a chance to speak yet, right? That's the kind of interrupter that you can use that will allow more people to contribute and to be part of that meeting. But I do think meetings are a really nice place to be able to look in and see, how is it running and how could we do it better?
Thank you. In the workplace, as elsewhere, isn't real inclusion also the common realization that actual differences maximize our throughput and efficiency, rather than pretending we are all absolutely equal, which is a strong scope reduction?
So yeah, I think that the right way to think about real inclusion is that you're learning from differences. You allow for the fact that people are different and have had different experiences, some of which comes from social identity groupings and some that comes from lots of other things. But we want to embrace and leverage those differences. And that's exactly right. That's where we have the chance to really reap some of the benefits of diversity. And so that's why I gave the example, a colorblind kind of a model is not real inclusion. If you don't allow people or encourage people to bring their whole selves and all of the aspects that they have developed over time, if that can't come to work, you're not going to actually be able to leverage what they're bringing. And so real inclusion is about learning from differences and not pretending that differences don't exist, right? Those are the organizations where nobody's even willing to talk about anything because we're all pretending that it's not there, and that's no good. And it's also important not to put people into a certain place and expect that they're only here for this specific reason. That's another way that you're not at all going to leverage diversity, but instead you're going to shut it down. That's not real inclusion either. So I very much agree with this notion that it's about leveraging and allowing for differences rather than pretending that they're not there.
Great. So in the context then of learning, what are some good measurements for an organization to determine how you are doing with D&I?
So as I said, I think the most common thing that the measurement that people are using is representation metrics. And those are certainly important. I'm not going to pretend that those aren't really important. So things like who you're hiring and who you're promoting, right, as that pipeline from step 1 to step 6 I showed, that's really important. It's also important, even when we're focused on our representation metrics, not to take them across the whole organization, but to think more carefully. If there's certain departments or certain positions at your organization that are more powerful and earn more money, you want to make sure that that's not where certain people are hiding out there, and then you create your diversity only in the other spaces that aren't considered as important. So representation metrics are important, and you want to think about those carefully, not just as sort of overall number. But then when I say push beyond diversity, we want to think about other kinds of metrics. And so there are lots of things you could measure. One thing that a lot of companies are already doing is some sort of climate survey. But when you look at your climate survey, you want to see whether whether work is experienced differently by different people, by different employees. And so you can use elements from your employee survey, like belongingness or willingness to recommend this to somebody, willing to recommend this as a company that someone I know should work for. Those kinds of measurements can be important, but you want to make sure you're not looking just, again, at everybody together, but specifically to look to see whether different employees are feeling different experiences in terms of whether they belong, or in terms of whether they would recommend it, or in terms of whether they feel like their views are respected, anything like that. But really, so I guess just to hit home this again, it depends on what your goal is. So you need to think about what your goal is. Why are you investing in this? And when you know your goal, hopefully the metrics that make sense for that goal will be more clear to you. And so it depends on what your goal is. You're going to help determine what the right metric is for your organization.
Terrific, thank you. So in helping to establish goals, do you have any guidance or tips around the best way to present D&I efforts to leadership?
So I think it's always really useful to align the goals with what the organization already cares about. So this idea, it's not just the business case, because that's a little bit broad to just say, it'll help us, we'll make more money or something like that. You really want to specify how and why you will, and tie it back to the values that are already there. I actually had a wonderful experience for myself in thinking about this. And there are lots of different, values that the U of C, the University of Chicago has broadly, and that Booth has as well. And some of them tie very much back to diversity and inclusion. And so instead of thinking thinking about any reason or my own personal reason, it's really much more helpful for me to think about how it lines up. And so in thinking about whether, in a place where we're supposed to let all the best ideas compete, right? In a marketplace of ideas, we need to make sure that all ideas are represented, and we need to make sure that we are creating an environment where everybody feels comfortable bringing those ideas to bear. And so for a place like the University of Chicago, or Booth in particular, diversity and inclusion are part of what it means to create our own values. How are we going to allow ideas to compete? How are we going to allow ideas to build on each other without making sure that we have access to those ideas and creating an environment that allows those ideas to flow forth?
Terrific. So we're coming up on the top of the hour here, and I think we have time for just one more question. And there's a question here that really sort of speaks to just the overall tone that we're seeing in the country today. And that is a much broader question. What do you think will truly motivate people to change their behaviors and to work on their biases over time? It's incredibly hard work that requires a lot of discipline and commitment. Yeah. How do people stay motivated to continue to work on this over the long term? What are your thoughts?
So it's a great question. I think so much about this maybe comes back to this mindset that we talked about. If you can have humility and a learning orientation when it comes to this space, then there's a continued opportunity for growth. And it may be slow at times, but you'll always continue to see that I can get better and better at this. I can understand where other people are coming from, and I can recognize what else I need to do. There's new spaces to think about, like, oh, accessibility, that's something I might not have been thinking about when it comes to inclusion. You're always going to be able to add more and continue the work without it feeling like it's somehow without it feeling like you're doing something wrong, and that makes you a bad person. And so I think one reason that people kind of step out of this is because it's uncomfortable. And so part of what we want to do is get people a little uncomfortable. Like, it's okay to be uncomfortable. This is part of the process of growing and learning. I also have heard this wonderful analogy in terms of birds when they're flying into headwinds, is that they rotate. So that the bird in the front is not always the bird that stays in the front. They're going to rotate to the back. And that's an important thing too. So you need to sort of set up your own goals for yourself. But when it comes to pushing the envelope in the organization or even sort of in social movements, it's okay to rotate who's taking the lead. So you're going to continue to be someone who's working towards this. But if you are completely exhausted by this, you need to find other people, other allies who are going to able to step into that spot that's kind of breaking the wind, like, right, that's taking that headwind on. And so you need to stay engaged, but it doesn't mean you need to stay engaged at the extreme all the time. You can let other people step into that leadership role, and let them help as well. And that's one thought anyway.
Terrific. Well, with that, we are completely out of time. Thank you very much, Jane, for your time and your energy. And thank you to all of our participants today.
Great. Yeah, thank you.